Thank you, and thank you to GOSEC for and Serene Risk for inviting me. Like you just heard, my name is Rasmus. I'm a PhD student at the University of Montreal, and today I'm going to be sharing some of my PhD research. So there'll be some broad theoretical questions that I'm trying to work with, and then I'm going to present some more concrete empirical findings from my research. So start off by giving sort of a primer on these illicit online markets that I study. Then I'm going to discuss the problems of trust in illicit online market and sort of move into the problem of social order. And after that, I'm going to present some findings and finally put out some discussion points where I think we're headed and so on. And there will also be time for some questions. So I'll start with a primer on crypto markets, which is the specific type of illicit online markets that I study. You might be familiar with them already. Perhaps the names Silk Road, Alphabet, Evolution, or Dream Market will ring a bell. But yeah, so broad introduction to them. Yeah. So crypto markets is a term we use to reference a subgenre of illicit online markets that have been sort of operational since 2011. They also go under names like anonymous online markets, illicit online markets, or darknet markets. So there's sort of a confusion in terminology there. Martin provides sort of the first description of these markets and tries to summarize them in like an ideal type. This is sort of the qualities of the ideal crypto market, what they usually share. Martin, he writes that the crypto market may be defined as an online forum where goods and services are exchanged between parties who use digital encryption to conceal their identities. And ideal type crypto markets may also share some of the characteristics like reliance on the Tor network, the use of cryptonyms, that would be pseudonyms, I guess, to conceal user identities, the use of traditional postal systems, third-party hosting and administration, decentralized exchange networks, use of encrypted electronic currency, mostly Bitcoin. So I think Martin was perhaps a bit too broad in this original definition, because the fact is that since the Silk Road started in 2011, things haven't really changed that much. I was working on that recently, and thinking apart from the market sort of growing into the hundreds of millions of dollars sort of processed through the year, they haven't really changed. The websites look the same, and what goes on in them is pretty much the same as well. So this is what they typically look like. This is a screenshot from a market called Rapture. It was a small market that primarily catered to the UK population. As you can see, it sort of just looks like, like eBay written in the 90s or something. The layout isn't very sophisticated, but you have some categories of drugs. So you have 6 drug listings, and 5 of them from one seller and 1 from another seller. As you can see, there are little stars, there are quantities, and so on. So what we're essentially talking about is just websites that function and are organized like most other platform economies. Think of Uber, Amazon, eBay. They share a lot of the same qualities with them. Namely, that will be that they offer reputation systems, that is, feedback systems, where you can rate the sellers. And they offer dispute resolution. So in case there is a conflict, you don't get what you paid for, etc., you can call a moderator or an administrator. So the main difference actually lies in that the layout is a bit old school, and the fact that they use anonymizing networks and cryptocurrencies, and of course that everything that goes on in them is highly illegal. Other than that, they're just like your regular platform economy. They'll mainly be using the Tor network and Bitcoin, though we have seen some other cryptocurrencies make way into it. So a big innovation of these markets is the availability of escrow services, which simply just means that when you buy drugs, the administrator will sort of hold on to the cash, and then you'll get your drugs and you'll press a little button that says, I got the drugs. The transaction finalizes and the seller is now in possession of the money. So it sort of gives the administration leverage to control what goes on here. Sellers in these markets, we refer to them as vendors. They'll typically sell products in exchange for a commission that will hover around 4 to 8%. Last week I learned that some of the hotel booking platform economies actually charge a commission of up to 30%. So this is quite a good deal, I think. These markets, they mainly supply illicit substances, the classic ones, so that'll be, your crack cocaine, your cannabis, and your heroin. But they've also sort of grown to also include in their product selection things like stolen data, that'll be credit cards, etc., various digital goods, accounts for services, and in some rare cases, we've also seen weapons and poisons sold on them. So, sort of moving on to my PhD research. You're often asked as a PhD student, like, what is your research about? Can you summarize it in one sentence? And I think I've actually managed to do that because it's a pretty simple existential question, which is, why on earth would anyone trust an online drug dealer to actually be honest? I mean, there's not a lot of good reasons to do that, as if drug dealers weren't sketchy enough already. Now they're anonymous and they're somewhere in the world and you're paying them with a currency that it's irreversible Bitcoin transactions. So in the broader scheme, it's not just a question about just trusting drug dealers. It's also about like a question of social order and disorder in markets. In order to have functioning markets, in order to coexist and to make exchange with each other, we need to have stable expectations. We need to know that usually I can trust people to come through when, I take this leap of faith. And so the summary of that is sort of just the idea that if we don't have these stable expectations, then we can't really act economically. Luhmann puts it really well when he argues that sort of when you trust someone, you extend sort of the potential action you can do. Yeah. So sort of just trying to summarize these problems of trust in like a more everyday language, like we can sort of approach these markets as being organized and designed in a way that seeks to solve some very fundamental problems of trust. So those would be, questions like who will live up to my expectations of them? How can we estimate the honesty of another person and we have to pick and choose between who we trade with? And how do we separate honest people from dishonest people? Because the problem is, like I hinted at before, it's essentially a gamble when you buy drugs online. Like, first and foremost, the seller you're buying from could be law enforcement. They could also be horribly incompetent and be detected by law enforcement. We have seen cases where drug dealers have sort of, their hard drive was encrypted and everything, but they left the password on a yellow post-it note on the screen and kept customer records. So you have to trust someone to not do those things. A seller can, of course, also just be plainly dishonest. They could not send the drugs and say that they sent them. They could send low quality drugs. They could be cutting it. This is not uncommon either. We see a lot of false advertising when it comes to people saying how good their drugs are. They could also send another drug, think heroin and fentanyl. That's really scary. They could also send something poisonous. And then finally, you also have the market and the administration, which have a track record as sort of a class of people for being quite dishonest. We have a phenomenon we call marketplace exit scams, where they will just sort of vanish and disappear with all the money in escrow. And this is a pretty regular occurrence. I think we recently got a firm number of how big one of these exit scams were. I think it was around 10 million. And it would be even bigger today if you ran off with all the money. A marketplace can, of course, also conspire with a seller. It's not uncommon. Like, it's not impossible to think that a marketplace will be willing to, give a large-scale seller who reeks in a lot of commission for them some wiggle room. Maybe they'll remove bad reviews, things like that. And of course, they could also just be law enforcement. We saw last year or the year before, I think, we saw law enforcement running a marketplace after they had seized it, or running it for about a month, siphoning all the data that they could get. So moving a bit further, like if we try to sort of conceptualize and group and abstract a bit from these problems, what we see is, we have an absence of legal institutions which create stable expectations in normal markets. You don't have regulations. There's no regulation saying if you sell MDMA, it has to be MDMA. And then you have the problem of anonymity and pseudonymity, which of course means that you don't know where in the world your drug dealer is. You can't really go and beat him up, and you can't do the same with your customer. And then finally, we also have sort of the characteristics of drug markets and illicit online markets in general, which are also present in these markets. If we try to sort of group them using some theoretical language, we have the problem of opportunism. Sellers and administrators tend to be opportunistic once in a while. They will do fraud, they will do these exit scams. We also have extensive product uncertainty. Then regarding like quality and fit, like I discussed before, the quality of product varies. You're not really sure what you get, but it's not just the drugs, it's also the service. We call it stealth, the way people package their drugs. And imagine ordering drugs and it just comes a couple of pills rattling around in an envelope. That's kind of shady. You'd want them to come, vacuum sealed in a bag that can't be smelled by a dog. But you don't know that until you've purchased from a drug dealer. In terms of fit, we can also think of something like bag appeal. If you're buying to resell drugs, which is something people will also do in these markets, you want your drugs to look good. Imagine getting let's say an ounce of cannabis that's pressed tightly, it's only small knocks, it doesn't look pretty, you're not gonna get a good profit off that. You want things to look good. So these are some of the problems when you buy from someone, you're not sure about this. More broadly, we can also think of this in terms of like the problem of unstandardized goods, which is a key problem in informal or illicit markets. Think of places like a bazaar. The cool thing about having standardized products is you can go anywhere in the world and a Coca-Cola is going to be the same, and you can compare Coca-Cola from all over the world and figure out where do I get the cheapest cola. You can't really do that with drugs because there's no, content list. There's no purity that's agreed on. I mean, even the quantity varies. I was coding the weight of some products the other day, and I discovered an ounce can be anything from 26 grams to 30 grams. There's not even an agreement on what an ounce consists of. That was people writing it's an ounce, and then they wrote how many grams was in an ounce. So drugs are unstandardized. And then finally, what economists will talk about is they're going to talk about information asymmetry, the fact that a seller knows more about the product than the buyer does. And then it gets even more complicated because the seller is receiving Bitcoin in exchange, and you know what Bitcoin is, you know how much it's worth. So one person is exchanging on the one hand a product that's standardized, you know what it is, versus something that's not standardized. So that sort of brings us to this problem of why on earth are people then willing to trust? Because apparently these markets do exist and they continue to grow. There's sort of two perspectives if we look through the literature on illicit online markets and crypto markets on why people trust and sort of the basis of social order and how we create these stable worlds of exchange. And so the first position, which we could call sort of the reputation system position, it argues that the reputation system is central to creating social order. And it does that because by giving feedback and leaving feedback on someone's profile, you reward and you punish dishonest behavior. So through that mechanism, you incentivize honest behavior, and sellers who, for example, perform very well will be able to, their product will be seen as higher quality and they can charge a bit of a premium. I think that's what you found in the literature. And it's because of in a more poetic language, we have to say, people call it a shadow of the future. You can create more certainty about the other. But then there's also sort of another school, which is mainly represented by criminologists, who argue that what is central to creating order in these markets is control. You have a lot of mechanisms that ensure that we constrain opportunism, that we sort of limit how dishonest people can be, and we set limits to who are allowed to do things. For example, sellers will be allowed to go outside the escrow system to demand to get the money up front if they have a track record of acting honestly. So for things like vetting, control, and punishment, which is typically enacted through administrators and moderators, is also a way of creating social order. And then finally, we sort of have this third position about trust, which is that what we see across a lot of different illicit online markets is that transactions tend to be between people who have already traded before. And then the problem I really could see when I was reading through the literature is that we see that there is actually kind of a conflict in the literature. Like the first position sort of insinuates that people are atomized, they're floating out there. There's no real regulation of action. As Hardy and Nørgaard write, a marketplace where feedback mechanisms and reputations are the only things keeping the market functioning. And then on the other hand, you have someone like Lusthaus who says that administrators and other side officials insert a degree of trust. So there's sort of a weird disconnect here. And then we come to like just putting the problem out in an empirical manner. People really only tend to study their own variables when they want to study this. So you'll see, have a study of the reputation mechanism and how it's highly correlated with different things, but you only really include the reputation mechanism. So moving on to the paper I am presenting, it's in peer review right now. And it's a paper in which is empirical. And I try to sort of synthesize these perspectives on trust in illicit online markets. And then I try to apply this synthesis in an empirical manner. For that, I use datasets from two markets, a market that existed some years ago called Abraxas, and a newer one called Silk Road 3.1. Yes, we're at the third 0.1 iteration of Silk Road. Today, it's not going to be specifically what I have in the paper, because I actually managed to extend my datasets, triple the size. So I'm only using data from one market. But that one is triple the size. So sort of the argument I have in my PhD research is that I want us to try and move beyond this conflict in the literature, and I want to start somewhere else. And the place I want to start off is sort of proposing that the basic state of people in the crypto markets is that the informational base of trust, the information that you base your expectations of others on, is just almost completely lacking. And so since there's very few good reasons to trust, what we're essentially doing as buyers in these markets is we're fumbling around in the dark looking for any type of evidence about the trustworthiness of others. So within economic sociology, there's a school we refer to as the newer economic sociology, which has it's a pretty simple point, but they suggest that, trust in others can be based in different sources. And these sources will moderate each other, and in different contexts, different sources of trust will be important. If you think of trust from a sociological point of view, trust is fundamentally a question of being and acting as if, believing and acting as if the other party will not harm you. Think about telling a secret to a friend. You believe that the person is not gonna, tell someone else. And of course, one aspect of harm is financial. So I propose that the value of how much you're sort of willing to bet that the other party is honest is a pretty good indicator or manifestation of trust. The notion of trust as a bet is from the Polish sociologist Stomka, and I really like it. It's sort of, you take a bet that the other person will be honest, because a bet always, it's not a gamble, but it is, you have a good idea of why you're betting. There's both rationality, but it's not completely certain. Following this line of reasoning, I think we can just simply pose the question, what are the associations between sources of trust and financially risky behavior? So I believe this is a reasoning that you can apply. Looking back at it, after I wrote the paper, I think this reasoning actually borrows a bit from laboratory studies, where you often will also just ask people to play trust games with money and things. So briefly about the research design, data was collected using web crawling and web scraping, which is pretty much the established methodology for collecting quantitative data on these markets. At the Darknet Anonymity Research Center at the University of Montreal, we collect a bunch of that data. I have a quite unique data set, which has the full names of people who left feedback, which means I can do some more things with it that we usually can't do. The dataset contains like around 85,000 transactions, which are between 22,000 buyers and about 373 vendors. It's across 25 drug categories, and we have purchases of about 5,000 different ads. So just quickly in terms of methods, because I need to go through this. we can see the transaction value, the outcome of sort of the study I'm doing, as naturally nested within countries, categories, vendors, and buyers. We expect all of these factors to have an influence when it comes to how much you're buying. So for that reason, I apply multi-level linear regression, which is also known as mixed effects regression or hierarchical linear regression. Looking at the different variables I use, again, the outcome is the value of a transaction. And it's a multi-level model, so each transaction is sort of nested within a level. In statistical terms, we give an intercept to each vendor, origin, category, and buyer. There's, of course, some control variables. These things will control. And then I also control for sort of how diverse the vendor's activity is, who it is, and where they're shipping from. The more interesting variables are, of course, the ones grounded in theory. So I operate with three sources of trust. First off, I operate with an idea of status and an institutional approval, status that is given to you by this institution. These markets will typically put a little star next to vendors saying this is a trusted vendor. They will give a little badge that says this guy is in, the 99th percentile or something like that. Or they will give a little level, trust level or something to them. Then, of course, I also operate with reputation because it's seen as a major source of trust in the literature. And finally, because this data set allows me to establish relations between buyers and sellers, I also operate with social, economic, or transactional ties as a source of trust. So moving on to some findings, I'm trying to present some key findings here, and we'll sort of skip over the details, but if you ask really nicely, I can send you the paper after. And as I said before, I also only present findings from one market to keep it less confusing. And because I tripled the size of the data set, and that was really cool. So just briefly about the random effects, so sort of what affects the value of a transaction. The figure you see is sort of the intercept for each of these different levels you have. Conceptually, think of them as group effects. So the average value of a transaction, it's very high for some categories and origins, lower for others. So what we of course see is the drugs are extremely, the mean transaction value is a lot higher in Australia than it is in Europe, which is, finding that sort of confirms that the data seems solid because that's what we also know from the literature. Interestingly, most variance in that is among vendors, which would suggest that some vendors just on average have like very high transaction values, whereas others have very low ones. What we also find is, and this is interesting, is that the association between reputation and transaction value actually seems to be different among vendors within the population of vendors. So that suggests that we call it the effect of reputation is not the same for every drug dealer. Moving on to sort of the main results, to the right you see a coefficient plot. Again, reiterating the outcome is the transaction value, which is log transformed. Coefficients are standardized by 2, so that's why they might look a little extreme, but it's to give sort of a better comparative basis. So if you look in the top under purple, you'll see that, which is a really interesting findings, that transactions that are in escrow or in 50-50 escrow and finalized early, meaning advance payment, they actually tend to be significantly higher in value than those in escrow. So that's surprising because it's a side finding, but first off, we would have expected that when people took really risky decisions, they would rely on the escrow systems. What we also see is that when we have included all of these controls, there is no significant association between either negative ratings or positive ratings and transaction value. It seems that the effect of these is actually among vendors, different vendors. Looking at the status indicators, there is some, you can sort of the number functions as a good indicator of what we're talking about. But I mean, there is some significance, but it's not like a huge effect of having a higher level as a drug dealer. Where it becomes really interesting is what happens when we introduce social ties into the equation. What happens when people have established a social tie with a drug dealer? Well, what we see is that all coefficients sort of change around, become significant, take on interesting directions. For example, we see that positive ratings seem to be negatively associated with a higher transaction value when you have traded with a vendor. We also see that negative ratings tend to be positively associated with transaction value when you have traded with a vendor. But the most astounding finding is that we see that there is sort of a significant, how should we call it? You time up, you add a certain percentage. I think it's about 0.2 percentage larger transactions for each percentage more that you have traded with a vendor. What we see is that the size of your previous transactions increases the size of your future ones. So moving on to some discussion points from this. What I found in this and also the other, an important note is that in my study of the other market, we see that status indicators have a larger effect. But generally what we see is that social ties and status and institutional approval, whichever term we like to use for it, are predictive of economic action and of what we conceptualize as trust in these markets. Being a sociologist, I would say this suggests a pattern in which, upon the introduction of a social relation, the informational base of trust switches from the impersonal reputation or status indicators to being a question about personal experience. Most interestingly, this does not really conform to the existing literature and theory about online markets, illicit and licit, when we see and argue that reputation systems is sort of what creates social order. And again, having read too much economic sociology and economic anthropology, I think that this is interesting because it's the same pattern we see in extremely informal and highly uncertain markets. Think of bazaars. In bazaars, people will tend to go back to the same seller because otherwise things get too complicated. It's also what we see in traditional illicit markets, also more very uncertain markets like markets for credit. We also have to I think we have to pose the question of why does reputation systems fail in this context? My suggestion would be that this is because when we say reputation system, we're actually not talking about reputation. Reputation in a sociological and anthropological sense is information propagated by people around you. And the reason reputation works is because trust is transferable. I didn't go to GOSEC because I read it online after Googling it, getting an invitation. I went here because my advisor suggested it would be a good idea and I trust my advisor. Trust is transferred. And you can't really transfer trust based on anonymous feedback online. And if I have to sort of end off, what I want to stress is that because we see that sort of the potentiality of economic action extends, that people seem to be willing to transact more and for higher values if they have established social ties. This is not just a story about black markets and people buying and selling drugs online. It's also a story about sort of the possibility and the existence of trust among cyber criminals. I mean, does this suggest that in other illicit online markets we will see the same pattern of repeat transactions between people? How do people develop trust in each other? It seems that at least in this context, experience and social relations is key to that. And that'll be it.